Hello and welcome to Pandemic Puppies, How to Build Confidence in Your Pup One Paw at a Time, Part 2. My name is Jessica Benoit and I'm going to be walking you through this webinar. So we're going to discuss how do dogs learn, how to help your puppy in fearful situations. We're going to talk a little bit about the prevention of separation anxiety and why we recommend consulting with your veterinarian. So we're going to start off with some myth busting. So common dog training myths that you are going to hear is your dog shouldn't go through the door before you. They can't sleep on your bed. You should take items from them to show you who's boss, show them who's boss, and to teach them to be comfortable with having items removed. And we talked about that in part 1 and how that can increase stress and kind of the best way to remove items from a puppy, which would be the trading game. You need to be the alpha or boss, make them submit to you. Positive reinforcement training is bribery. Tough breeds need a firmer hand, as well as my dog knows he did something wrong. And so all of those things you may have already heard or you've read, but these are very much not based in science. And often some of this thinking can cause some breakdown in the relationship between you and your dog. So especially my dog knows he did something wrong. So often what happens is we have a lot of social media pictures that come out and videos of dogs displaying signs of stress. But the signs of stress that you're seeing is what we are interpreting as guilt. Which is misinterpretation, because often the ears back, the tail tucked, the averting gaze, like we talked about in part 1, is not guilt, it's stress and fear. And so the dogs are responding to either the tone of your voice or your body language, depending on what has gone wrong in that scenario. So it is not that your dog understands that they did something wrong. They are responding to your behavior. And it really does disrupt the relationship that you have with your dog as it scares them. It makes you appear untrustworthy. And so these are things that we need to think about. As far as positive reinforcement being bribery, positive reinforcement, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in this presentation, is really giving something to your animal that they would work for or motivated by to increase the behavior. So it's not necessarily showing them the treat first. It's paying for it once the behavior is displayed. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. As far as where your dogs sleep, they can sleep wherever you are comfortable with them sleeping. Having them sleep on your bed does not cause problems behaviorally. It's not something that you need to be concerned about. I've heard it for many, many years, where people almost feel like they're confessing to me that their dog is sleeping on their bed, and I couldn't care less where they sleep as long as they're happy and owners are happy with where they're sleeping. So these are just some things that you may hear, and I really wanted to bring them to your attention so you understand that they're not true. It's not something that you need to be concerned with. So a lot of those myths are based on dominance. And so dominance is the relationship between social mammals, and it is fluid and very complex. And it's a relationship between animals of the same species. So dogs versus dogs, cats versus cats, chickens versus chickens, for example. So it's within the species. It is not productive for dogs to be constantly fighting or over resources. They communicate with one another using appeasement behaviors, deference, so they'll defer to the other dog so that there isn't a fight. And what we're seeing in a lot of those interactions is what people misinterpret as kind of dominance or submission. And it is the one thing that you really need to understand about dominance. It is never, ever a relationship between humans and dogs. And it's very rarely even used when we describe relationships between dogs, because there's so many other complexities in that relationship between dogs. And often you will see, for example, one dog chewing on a bone and another dog walking by, and they might glance at the other dog, but if they but then they're going to keep moving and going on to maybe find their own resource or something else to do. It's not in their best interest to go and try and remove that resource from the other dog, because a fight is going to occur, likely. And so when you kind of have that misinterpretation between dogs, there's some other things going on, often fear, anxiety, inappropriate socialization or lack of socialization. So there's a lot more to it than just saying a dog is dominant or a dog is submissive. So to continue this, to assume your dog is behaving in order to increase rank or be dominant leads to punishment-based training. And we've seen this time and time again with Cesar Millan, for example, that alpha rolling, so pushing dogs down on their side, scruffing them, hitting them, yelling at them, all of these are punishment-based training techniques. And what they end up doing is increasing fear, anxiety, and stress. And so what we need to be aware of is that many trainers still base their methods on the dominance theory. And it has been debunked. This theory was debunked many decades ago. And initially, it kind of came to play based on a study that was done on wolves in captivity. And so they were watching wolves in captivity and how they behave. And what they started thinking was dominance and submission were ritualized appeasement behaviors between the wolves. But then they also realized that wolves in captivity behave differently than wolves in the wild. And then also wolves in the wild behave differently than dogs in the wild. And so what science has shown us now is that wolf packs are similar to human families, and that free-range dogs are usually found in groups of 2 to 5 unrelated members. So dogs are not pack animals. And then behaviors that we see that people might call dominance, like jumping on somebody, rushing through the front door, growling, snarling, those are behaviors that have either been reinforced or they're being displayed because your dog is showing signs of fear or stress or anxiety or aggression, which is where you would see the growling, but there are still underlying emotions. That's not just the dogs being dominant. That's not a personality trait. And so that's something that we really need to be mindful of moving forward with our relationships with our dogs. So we're going to talk about learning theory, and this is kind of the science of animal training. This is how we train multiple species, and this is how humans learn as well. So we're going to start by explaining what a stimulus is, and that's anything in the environment, a change in the environment. If the stimulus has no effect on the animal, it's a neutral stimulus. And if it's a stimulus that stands out and something that the animal notices, it's a salient stimulus. A stimulus that causes change of state in the animal, that causes him to perform a specific behavior, for example, is known as a cue. So we give a verbal cue, sit, the dog sits. And so the stimulus is that verbal cue. So it's really anything in the environment. So classical conditioning is the science of association, and we need to be really mindful of this with our puppies because they are really learning. They're like little sponges during their sensitive period. And so we are pairing what might be a lot of neutral stimulus. So something the animals never had an experience with. And so we're going to hope that it's neutral. The response is going to be neutral. And we want to be pairing it with food so that and the reason we're using food is one of these many reasons, is that we want to produce a positive emotional response to all these neutral stimulus in the environment, all these new things that your puppy's going to be seeing. We don't want to rely on the fact that they're just going to get used to it or they're going to acclimate to it. We need to set this up so that they're going to have a positive association with it. Because we don't want to have to be counter conditioning, which is changing their opinion of it or their emotions behind how they feel about the item. So conditioning looks like this. So this is a clicker. And so initially a dog, for example, doesn't know what a clicker is. They shouldn't have a response to it. They may if they're scared of the sound, but initially if it's neutral, it clicks. Nothing happens. There's no interest in it. If we pair the clicker with food over multiple pairings, and while the conditioning is occurring, we're going to eventually have a conditioned response to the clicker. So the result of pairing the clicker with food over and over and over is that the sound of the clicker by itself will start producing a conditioned response. And what happens is when we're using an unconditioned stimulus like food, it needs to produce a response by itself. And that's where pain also is an unconditioned stimulus, because that by itself will produce fear, stress, physiological responses. So what do we need to know about classical conditioning? It occurs in everyday life. It happens every time we interact with our animals or they're interacting with the environment. They can be making both positive and negative associations. And that's why we want to be, when we are exposing our puppies to all these new things, that's why we want to be using food and praise and choice. Choice is also very important. And so when pairing stimulus with food, we are more likely to make a positive association. And so here are some pictures of our puppy classes that we were doing in clinic. And we would often take all of these things that could be potentially scary, but also things that your puppy's going to see on a day-to-day basis, and get them comfortable with it. So costumes and appearances, veterinary husbandry, so nail trimmers, clippers, veterinary handling, vacuums and Swiffers and skateboards, things that roll. So we really work hard. And this is absolutely something you can be doing from home. It doesn't need to be done in a class. And sometimes with the pandemic, that's not an option. So this is stuff you can absolutely set up and let your puppy explore and check it out on their own. And every time they go to do that, it's paired with food. And another form of classical conditioning is what you're going to see when you start practicing your veterinary handling and husbandry. And so in this video, we are going to see touch being paired with food. And this is awesome because once your puppy comes into the veterinary clinic and we have to touch them to examine them or do a procedure, that touch, just like the click means treat, over time, that touch predicts food, but it also, the touch by itself will produce a positive emotional response. And when we're doing this type of training with handling, we always want to start at what's going to be the least stressful starting point. And so we need to assume, and we actually know that there are certain parts of dogs' bodies that are more sensitive. So their tails, their bum area, their paws, and often their mouths are much more sensitive than their back and the top of their head, and their ears tend to not be as sensitive if they haven't had previous ear infections or concerns that way. And so we want to start with the least stressful point and then work up to the most stressful point or potentially stressful with our puppies. And so we also train using operant conditioning. And so essentially what that is when we're using positive reinforcement, these are voluntary behaviors. So your dog is choosing to display these behaviors often, and then they're either reinforced or the behavior is punished. And so in this regard, the addition and subtraction does not mean good or bad. So positive and negative doesn't mean good or bad. It means adding or removing. So with positive reinforcement, the dog in this picture is walking in the loose leash walking position. And when he's walking there, he gets a treat. So we're more likely to see the loose leash walking behavior increase, which is what we want. If we are using negative punishment, which is essentially removal of something the animal wants, so delaying good stuff to decrease a behavior, is if the dog is pulling and we stop moving, the pulling behavior should decrease because the dog no longer gets to continue to walk. Positive punishment, negative reinforcement are two quadrants that we stay out of as best we can. We do not recommend positive punishment or negative reinforcement when training. So positive punishment is adding something aversive, so something that's scary or painful, to decrease a behavior, for example. So in this example, the dog is pulling, the owner jerks on the leash, and the intention of the tightening of the leash and the jerk is to decrease the pulling behavior. So we are adding something aversive to decrease the pulling. Negative reinforcement is when you are removing or delaying something bad to increase a behavior. And so the dog stays in the loose leash walking position because if it begins pulling, something bad is going to happen. And so, which is the jerk. And so that is the four quadrants of learning. And so we're going to start with positive reinforcement, and I've talked about it already a couple times. So this is essentially adding something that your dog likes: food, toys, attention, when they display a desired behavior, to increase the likelihood that the behavior will be repeated. It is absolutely what develops a healthy, trusting relationship between you and your dog. And it gives your dog control over the environment because they start learning that these behaviors predict something good is going to happen. And then they know what kind of works for them when they're out and about. And if he sits, I'm going to click, toss my treat. I'm going to wait for him to come back, repeat my sit, click, toss the treat. But I'm not asking him to sit, I'm just waiting. And I'm taking a picture with my clicker of the sit behavior and tossing my treat. And so negative reinforcement, removal of something aversive. So this often happens with leash corrections and body pressure. So the example I see the most is when we push our dogs' bums down to get them to sit. The dogs sit. So the sit behavior is being reinforced, but that's because they are trying to avoid. So they want to remove the pressure, which is the negative portion of this. The negative as in removing. They want to remove the pressure on their bum. And so they do. So in order to do that, they need to sit down. This isn't the best way to teach that behavior. We really would prefer that the behavior is offered, we can put it on cue, and then your dog is reinforced that way for the behavior by adding something they like, rather than having them try to avoid something negative. Positive punishment, I want to talk about it because of the side effects of it as well. So we talked about giving a leash jerk to decrease a pulling behavior as an example. The other things that happen with punishment, so dogs that are trained with a lot of punishment, so yelling, hitting, aversive training tools such as prong collars, choke collars, shock collars, it increases fear, anxiety, and stress. We have multiple pieces of literature that support that, scientific literature. It produces apathetic learners. So often these dogs don't even want to try because they're scared something bad is going to happen. It teaches pets that people are untrustworthy, and it also can teach them that other things in the environment are also negative and can produce a negative response. So for example, a dog sees another dog and barks, then they're shocked while they're barking. The shock may decrease the barking behavior because it works using positive punishment. If it is working the way it's intended, which I am not recommending, but I am using this as an example. So the shock will decrease the barking behavior. But what happens is that it also makes a negative association with anything else in the environment. So that dog is getting shocked on the neck, but they're also seeing a child walk by or the other dog that they're barking at. And now they start making a negative association, and you often will just see an increase in aggression and frustration and stress and fear. Because now every time they see another dog, something bad happens to their neck and their neck hurts. So we do not ever recommend aversive tools such as choke, prong, and shock collars. And it's not, if you feel like that's something you need or you're overwhelmed with your animal's behavior, please contact a positive science-based professional before using any of those tools. So appropriate training tools are humane, and they encourage your dog to perform the appropriate behaviors. And as I just said, the aversive tools such as prong collars, choke collars, and electric shock collars, they don't fix problems, and they absolutely work by hurting the animal. If it didn't hurt the animal, it wouldn't work. So they do hurt, they do scare. Shock collars in particular often get made to seem less than they are. So people say it's just a little tickle or it's just a little bit of stimulation. They absolutely hurt. Otherwise, they would not work. Flat collars and harnesses are the most humane and effective training tools as far as leash equipment goes. So negative punishment is removing something the animal likes to decrease the behavior. So if we are not careful, this can lead to frustration and extinction bursts. And so what our extinction bursts are is, let's say that your dog jumps on you and they jump and jump and jump. And then all of a sudden, and often you reinforce it or you variably reinforce it. So sometimes you pet them and talk to them, and other times you ignore them or you yell at them, which is actually still reinforcing. But what can tend to happen is when we all of a sudden decide, Kate, we are using negative punishment, we are going to remove all of our attention and ignore this behavior. An extinction burst is when the behavior it gets worse. So the dog doesn't understand why this behavior doesn't work anymore. And they'll try until the behavior extinguishes. But sometimes that can look very bad. And it can cause some frustration. This can work. Negative punishment can work, and it is considered humane. But we do need to be mindful of our dog's body language and behavior when we do this, because often I do recommend redirecting to an alternative appropriate behavior to decrease any frustration that you might get with using negative punishment. So essentially, we do want to work to build trust accounts. And so I want a reinforcement history with all of these behaviors. So that's what positive reinforcement training does. It says, I'm going to pay you for this. I'm going to pay you for this behavior. I'm going to pay you for this behavior. And so even if we make a mistake, and let's say we accidentally tug on a leash or we raise our voice, if you have built up enough of a trust account, that shouldn't damage your relationship with your dog as easily. It's not recommended to do either of those things, but sometimes real life happens. Let's say an off-leash dog comes up to your dog and starts barking and growling, but your dog has had so much positive reinforcement training on leash that let's hope that that's less stressful for them and less damaging and doesn't cause as many long-term effects. And so we really want to prevent damaging this trust account by using punishment, corrections, criticism. Like for humans, criticism, fines, and reprimands in particular are often what damages relationships, and it's not much different than our dogs. So when we are looking to solve a problem that we're having with our puppies, we need to be looking at the antecedents. So what occurs in the environment prior to the behavior being displayed? What happens before your dog barks at the window, right? Usually another dog goes by or a person is walking by. That would be your antecedent. Then the behavior is what the animal's doing. They are barking, right? That's the behavior that we're looking at. And what's the consequence? Well, whatever your dog usually is barking at goes away. So the behavior is actually negatively reinforced. If your dog is concerned with what's outside, right, then that scary person or that scary dog has now left, and they learn that if I bark even louder next time, maybe they'll go away faster. So how can we prevent and manage it? We really want to do that first. We really want to figure out what we can do to prevent or manage it while we are teaching an alternative appropriate behavior. If we're dealing with self-rewarding behaviors or human reinforced behaviors, sometimes the behavior is both. It can be a little bit difficult depending on what the motivation is, but it's always important that once you understand it, that you can prevent and management. And then we always want to teach an alternative appropriate behavior in a low distraction environment, and then start working on it in the environment that's needed. So here's an example. The problem behavior, the antecedent is people present petting the puppy. So there's people petting the puppy's very excited, and then the puppy starts biting. That's the behavior. And the consequence is usually social interaction. And so even if people are getting upset, it is still attention for the behavior. And so it's usually, the motivation is usually human attention seeking. Sometimes it could be self-rewarding if you're seeing a puppy biting, if they're teething because it's bothering their mouths. So what's a possible solution for this? We want to avoid petting the puppy for a short period of time. And that might seem strange, but often that is what's causing the biting, right? And so we need to increase enrichment, more chewing toys, more food puzzle toys. And we use confinement as needed. So maybe if your puppy's getting the zoomies at night and that's when it's most likely to bite and people are giving attention, we want to try and use management for that. So let's solve it. Let's remove the attention. As soon as the puppy bites, we stop moving. Everything stops. Can we ask them to do something else? When the puppy approaches for attention, can we get a touch behavior or a sit behavior? Or can we redirect to another chew toy and say, chew this instead? So these are all things that you can do this model for any behavior that your puppy is displaying. So let's talk about some training techniques using positive reinforcement. So what is the motivation? Dogs are food motivated. It's a primary reinforcer. They need it to survive. So that's why we use food for training. Do we use food for the rest of the dog's life? Well, often. So that's a question I get asked a lot. And I say it that kind of point blank because we can always, once a behavior is learned, start looking at other motivators, like being allowed to sniff on leash, chasing a squirrel, for example. We can use other things as reinforcement, petting, verbal praise. But when we're first teaching and we want to generalize these behaviors, we absolutely recommend using food. So using your dog's daily food ration is a great idea for training sessions. And then for dogs that aren't food motivated, often I rarely have met a dog like that. Toys and praise are possible alternatives, but I would be working with a professional in that regard. So dogs don't speak English. So I do remind people of this because they are always watching us. And that's why they respond so well to our body posture. And so often, even if we're using a verbal cue, sometimes dogs are actually looking at something else. And that's really the cue, even though we think we're giving a verbal cue. So the tone of your voice will increase or decrease the likelihood of your dog wanting to display a behavior. So please keep that in mind when you're using verbal cues. And I also recommend adding verbal cues only once the behavior is learned. And how do we know if a behavior is learned? We say if the dog can display the behavior about 8 out of 10 times or 80% of the time, that's when we're going to start adding the verbal cue. Or it can be a visual cue, it can be a hand signal, it can be an auditory cue. There's lots of different cues that we can use. So what are we going to do for training sessions? We want to have small, easily consumable treats or kibble. If you are working in a higher distracting environment, we want to increase the value of food. So you want to be using Benny Bullies or little pieces of cheese, very small, like pea-sized. You can cut them up into little pea-sized amounts using a clicker. And the reason we recommend using clickers, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more, is that clickers remove our body language and the tone of our voice. And so we are really focused often when we're using our clickers and we're watching an animal because we are trying to capture or shape or lure the behavior that we're looking for. And the click is like a camera. So it takes a picture of the desired behavior. And if we use a verbal cue, which I absolutely use verbal cues like yes or good to mark a behavior, the clicker really takes the tone of our voice out of that. And it's very fast and it's a salient cue. So dogs respond to clickers very well, and they do tend to learn and pick things up a little bit more quickly that way. And so we want to be training in a quiet environment with little distraction, and then slowly work up to more distracting environments when your puppy is ready. And so what is the clicker? It's a verbal or our marker is a verbal or audible signal that lets your dog know that's what I like and your treat is coming. So it always is followed by a food reward. So it's married. If you click, it means treat. You do not mess with that relationship. Yes, and we talked about using yes or okay as verbal markers. And mark and reward training is positive reinforcement. So the animal displays the behavior, we mark it, and then we give a treat. So I'm going to show you in these videos what luring is, and this is absolutely beneficial, especially for puppies learning new behaviors. It's a hands-off approach to guide an animal into a desired position or place. They are usually food lures. Sometimes you can use toys if you need to, or target sticks. And fading the lure is important because if we don't fade the lure, the food becomes the cue for the behavior. And that's where the bribery comes in often. And that's where you'll kind of hear people say, well, positive reinforcement is bribery. And it's like, and it is because if we haven't removed the food lure, it is bribery. But it's okay to lure initially. And then we work up to shaping or capturing the behavior. And so here are a couple of videos of luring. So she helps him into the down position with the treat, and then treat, treat, treat. And then we do the same thing with sit. So she uses her food to help his nose come up and his bum go down, and that's the sit position. And then she can reinforce the sit position. And so shaping, and we do shape a lot of behaviors. It's when we are building a behavior by clicking and treating small steps towards the goal behavior. So often, if it's a complex behavior, we'll write it out so we know exactly what we're reinforcing. And sometimes the dog will skip steps, and that's perfectly fine. Sometimes they end up on the same step for a little while, and that's okay. But it's just important when you're shaping, your rate of reinforcement should be high. So you should be clicking and treating pretty quickly and very consistently. If we increase criteria too quickly, the animal can become frustrated. And so in this video, all I'm doing is teaching Vegas to pick up a roll of duct tape. And you're going to see me start just by her looking at it, touching it, and then we work up to her picking it up with her mouth.
Time. Take it. Good girl. Take it. Take it. Take it. All done. Good girl. Time.
And so in that last video, you see me start adding the cue. And so she had done that. That was probably her second or third training session with that behavior. And so I started adding the take it cue right before I thought she was about to take it. And so this is another video of shaping, and I am teaching her to place her muzzle in the basket of the basket muzzle.
What I'm going to do first is I'm going to present the muzzle. I'm not going to push it towards the dog's face. And if they look at it, sniff it, interact with it, I will mark and treat them. Yes. And the first few times I do this, I'm actually going to toss it, yes, my treats away from the muzzle. So I'm not going to make them hold their muzzle in there for a long period of time at this point. Yes. Good girl. So any little step, yes.
So that's shaping muzzle. And then capturing, and we can often capture natural behaviors. So dogs sitting, dogs yawning, even dogs kind of backing up can be captured, taking steps backwards. So there's capturing down is one that we actually do often for puppies. Down is a harder behavior. You can lure it, but you can also just catch it. If your puppy's laying down, you can just give them a treat. Let them know that that's the behavior that you like. And so in this video, I am capturing her licking her lips, actually, of all things. And so essentially, as soon as I catch it, I click it, and then I give a treat. And sometimes capturing, if the behavior isn't offered frequently, can be difficult. And so it's important that it's something that occurs naturally. And this is a really cute video of a puppy. And this is how we teach loose leash walking often, is that we capture it. So we catch the dog while they are walking beside us with a smile in the leash. So with a loose leash. And so he's just waiting for her to start moving. And as soon as she starts moving, he clicks and treats. Yeah, beautiful.
Stella.
And so let's look at adding a cue. So we talked about when we are going to add cues, and it's just right before the behavior is going to occur. Sometimes I'll add cues as the behavior is occurring and then just start asking for it a little bit sooner and sooner every single time. But it really should not be added. So we do have a tendency as humans, because we're verbal communicators, to start asking for cues a little bit more quickly than we should. And the problem with that is that the dogs don't always understand what the behavior is that you're wanting. And sometimes we can poison our cues, which means we can kind of ruin them if we ask for them too quickly. And so that's often where you'll see, or you'll maybe even hear yourself saying, sit, 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 sit. And it's because maybe in that environment, your dog doesn't really actually understand the behavior. We see that in vet clinics a lot. And it's because the dog's probably never really been taught to sit in a vet clinic. And so generalizing behaviors is really important for dogs. And so this can be sometimes difficult for them if we don't teach it properly.
Down.
And so you see me give the hand signal as she is learning to lay on her side. So that's adding a cue. So using life rewards. So essentially what we often will ask clients to do is just make a list of things that your dog really likes. And so once they really seem to understand a behavior and it's on cue, we can absolutely start working on other motivators and other things that could reinforce behavior so that the behavior can last for the dog's lifetime. But that's where variable reinforcement comes into play. So if we reinforce every 20 sits or every 30 downs, that is a very strong form of reinforcement and can help maintain behavior. But just because we taught the behavior in puppy class doesn't mean we don't need to work on it for the rest of the dog's life, essentially. It doesn't mean that we need to be clicking and treating every single sit, but we can also be looking at, can we pet? Can we use praise? Can we use pets? Can we allow them to sniff on their walks? These are all forms of reinforcement that dogs really like. And often it is what is most distracting to your dog that's most motivating. So common training pitfalls is that we increase criteria too quickly. We ask too much of our animals often, all the time. And so we really need to consider the environment, the distraction in the environment, the value of the food that we're using. Is that reinforcing enough for what we're asking? Decreasing the rate of reinforcement. So I make jokes often, but I do tell people not to be cheap. So click and treat often, feed often, not generalizing behavior. And we talked about that with sit in the vet clinic. So if we don't teach it in the vet clinic, they may not understand it there. So I also will tell people to train the behavior where you would like it to occur. So we're not going to start training on leash outside necessarily. We might start in the house. And then we're going to work up to generalizing that behavior so that the loose leash walking behavior that's being done in the house can be done outside on a walk. Thinking that your dog knows it, you need to be considering their mental state and their physical health and the distraction of the environment. Because I hear that often as well, is that, well, they should know it or they do know it. And I think if we're watching our dogs really closely, they're telling us whether they know it or not. And so we really have to work within their means and at their pace. Adding the cue too quickly or saying cues when we are frustrated. And the reason that we don't want to be saying cues when we're frustrated is because it changes the tone of our voice. And that's one of the ways that you can poison a cue, because it turns into do this or else rather than sit. It turns into sit. And so that can be frustrating and scary. So increasing distraction too quickly, it can often lead to frustration for owners and for puppies. And so we need to just do it incrementally as your puppy's ready. And honestly, it's not going to hurt your puppy to be training with less distraction for a longer period of time. It'll all work out in the end. I always say slower is faster. So what do we do if we're working on training or we're working on introducing our puppies to new things in the environments or new scenarios and they're scared? So let's talk about what fear, anxiety, and stress is. Fear is a combination of physical, emotional, and physiological responses to a threatening stimuli or situation. So essentially, your puppy is going into fight, flight, freeze, or fidget mode if they are fearful. Anxiety is a sense of apprehension. So they don't know what's going to happen, and that's causing stress for them. And then stress is how your body reacts to a challenge or stressor. This is a response that's necessary for life. And so our dogs, by the age of 8 weeks of age, our puppies have adult-like learning. And the retention of memory during that time is very, very good. And that's why we are so careful about recommending exposure, but also doing it very carefully, because those are memories that are going to stick. And so it's important to remember that you can't reinforce fear. That is a huge misconception. We do recommend, please comfort your pet if they're displaying signs of fear. It was traditionally thought that it would make it worse, but that's absolutely not what's going on. If you gave somebody an ice cream cone during a thunderstorm, it's not going to make them more scared of thunder. We recommend using treats when your pet is fearful to change their underlying emotions. So that's when we're going to try and counter condition them, so that we want to change their opinion and their emotions about what they're scared of. If your pet is not taking food, they are not likely learning anything new in that situation, and they need to absolutely be removed. So when we are dealing with a concern such as fear, a behavior problem that's kind of underlying emotion is fear, we absolutely cease punishment. So if punishment is being used, we do not recommend it. We avoid the situations that cause the behavior to occur. And we always want to ensure that your pup's physical, social, and emotional needs are being met. And so when we're talking about changing a fearful puppy's emotions, we're doing so using desensitization and counter conditioning. And so desensitization is when you're presenting a stimulus at a low enough level that it does not cause a response. So if desensitization was just used all on its own, which we rarely do, if the exposure was gradual enough, eventually the animal should habituate or become acclimated to whatever is scary. But what we do is we take desensitization, so the gradual exposure of something scary, and we pair it with food. And that's us counter conditioning. So we're changing the animal's underlying emotional response from a negative emotional response to a positive emotional response. This is a treatment for fearful animals across the board. And so this is a video of a dog that's actually scared of veterinary handling. And so we taught her to do a chin rest behavior. And that also gives her a lot of choice and control for her veterinary exam. So she can choose to participate with her chin rest or choose not to participate. If she lifts her chin up, we stop. But each touch and each step of her veterinary exam was paired with food and a click and treat, so that she starts changing her negative emotional response to veterinary handling to a positive one. And she enjoys being there.
Can you come back? Chin. Pet. Poke. Go ahead. Chin. Pet. Poke. Go ahead. Good girl. Chin. Teeth. Ear. Pet. Tail. Go ahead. Good girl. All done. Good girl. All done. Good job.
And so this is, I always show this video when I'm talking about desensitization and counter conditioning, because this is a video of me desensitizing and counter conditioning my chicken to a stethoscope. And so chickens are usually scared of anything new. That's pretty normal for their species. But this is a video of me teaching her that stethoscopes aren't scary. And so if you are finding that your puppy is scared of something, we should begin making a list from what is least fearful to most fearful for them. And if it's just one scenario, for example, it might be like kids on bikes at 30 feet away, kids on bikes at 20 feet away, kids on bikes at 40 feet away, or 10 feet away, sorry. And so you're going to start from least fearful to most fearful. And in this scenario, these examples, I said a kid on a bike is least fearful, but a kid wearing a costume is more fearful than that. And a kid running is even more fearful, screaming, approaching, and trying to pet the puppy. So this will give you a starting point. We want to be pairing each one of these steps with food. We are only going to move as quickly as our dog is comfortable. So if they're displaying loose body language, if they seem interested in what's going on, then you might be able to move a little bit closer. And how can we set up the environment for success? Maybe not taking the dog to like an off-leash, a skate park, for example, would probably be scary for a puppy that's scared of kids on bikes. And so you might just go near a children's playground and see if you can find one child on a bike. Or you set them up as training sessions where you have somebody like a training professional help you set these sessions up for you. And it's always important to keep them short and successful. And I always tell people that they're very boring. If you're doing desensitization and counter conditioning properly, it should be boring, because we do not want your puppy close enough or dealing with the intensity of the stimulus in a way that would cause stress. So this is dogs that are reactive to other dogs. And what that means is that they will display a lot of different behaviors depending on the individual animal. But these dogs, for example, may lunge, bark, pull, growl when they see another dog. And so what we're doing is at a distance that's appropriate for that dog, depending on the training that they've had, we are teaching them that the sight of the other dog predicts that they get a click and treat. And so that's how we are counter conditioning them. They see the other dog and they go, oh, good things happen. And then over time, the other dog actually becomes a cue to look at you. And that's the response substitution. So that's the alternative appropriate behavior that we would rather have, right? We would rather have a dog look at another dog on leash than look back at us to be reinforced. But first, in order often to get another behavior, an alternative appropriate behavior when you're dealing with dogs that are scared, you need to first change their opinion about what they're looking at often, or working with before you can get another behavior, because sometimes they're a little too scared to start just displaying other behaviors. But it really is dependent on the case and the level of fear. So here's a video of dogs, both these dogs looking at one another and getting clicks and treats, and also looking at the owner. So. And then here's a video of another dog doing it from a distance. So these dogs, the dog on the right in this video is much further away from the other dog because she needs to be that far away in order to not become scared or anxious.
And bring her back this way.
Good job. That's a clever girl. Yeah, you saw him again? Nice. Good girl. Oh.
So this is absolutely an exercise that you can do preventatively with your puppies. You can go out on walks and they can get clicked and treated for seeing all sorts of things, so that preventatively we are teaching them good things happen when you walk nicely beside me, and we can observe everything and you get treats. So it's absolutely recommended to do from a preventive standpoint as well. And so we need to talk about a little bit about threshold, because threshold is the point where a stimulus is strong enough intensity to cause a reaction. And if we say that an animal is over threshold, they are too close to the stimulus. So they aren't able to really learn alternative appropriate behaviors or become more comfortable with it because they're too close. So behavior that's often seen if an animal is quote unquote over threshold, they might be pulling, barking, they could be hiding, not taking treats, shaking. So these are some signs of stress that you may look for if your puppy is in a situation that you're maybe not 100% sure if they're comfortable. And so this is a video of a dog that's over threshold.
All the chemistry that we have, I don't think that Ash is completely realistic about some of the challenges that we're going to face as a couple, especially when it comes to moving to the U.S. with his son Tosh.
That is the one, yes.
Good boy. Yes, touch.
Avery told me.
And so this is the same dog after some training and behavior modification. And so he was able to watch and respond to cues and behave more calmly once he is under threshold.
Works really well too.
See? Like, did you see how quick he snapped his head around
Yeah.
that car?
Okay, touch. Good boy.
Just want you to get those.
Touch. Good boy. That's not the best video, but okay. Yeah, I know you love the big guys.
Good boy, Bruno. I looked over at the ginger, but I know there's cheese over here.
So you can see he's able to respond to cues. The owner doesn't have to put food right in front of him to kind of get his attention. So that's the difference between a dog that's much too stressed and a dog that can learn. So this is a really nice video of what I was talking about when they're able to use response substitution. So they've learned over time that the sight of a trigger, which is a person or car, whatever is causing the stress, another dog becomes a cue to look at the owner. And so this is a dog that's actually fearful of people, but the owner spent a lot of time teaching the dog that if you look at people, good things happen. You look at people, good things happen. And now when the dog looks at a person, she is able to disengage and look at her owner for reinforcement.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
It's not recommended to do this exercise off of a leash necessarily, but this owner is a trainer as well. And she wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't an area that she was allowed to have her dog off of the leash. So flooding, this is often what can happen in a lot of scenarios when that's not the intention, but we need to be aware of it because it can be very, very traumatizing for our puppies. So flooding is when you're exposing a learner to a fearful stimulus at a high level of intensity. This happens at the dog park. It happens with swimming in this picture, for example, where we kind of place our puppies in situations that they're very obviously scared of. And in order for flooding to actually work, they would have to be placed in the scenario and the intensity needs to be so high that they stop reacting. But what we find if flooding, we don't ever recommend flooding, but if it happens, responses are very explosive. So you will see dogs urinate, defecate. This can happen in vet clinics when they're pinned on their side for nail trims, at the groomers. There's lots of situations that this happens in. And so it's something to be very mindful. And you'll see something called learned helplessness. And so often people misinterpret it as the animal being calm or finally giving in essentially, but it's essentially the animal giving up. So they literally feel like they have no control over the situation at all. So they stop fighting and they look calm, but they're not. They're just so scared. But they don't know what else to do. So they stop trying to escape. So we need to be very mindful of this. It is very damaging if it happens. So let's talk about preventing stress while alone, because a lot of our puppies right now are home with us, and they may be for a long time still, we're not sure. And so we need to know how to navigate this to set them up kind of for success. So let's talk about separation anxiety. It is a veterinary diagnosis. It needs to be diagnosed by a veterinarian. Physical, physiological, and or behavioral signs of distress exhibited by the animal is only in the absence or lack of access to a client or to the owner. And so virtual absences is when, and it also can occur when the owner is present, but they can't see them. So behind a door, maybe if there's a baby gate and the owner's gone upstairs, you may start seeing signs of stress. And so there are many risk factors that contribute to separation anxiety. And so we do work to prevent it, but sometimes this is out of our hands. So genetics, maternal stress and care, poor socialization, dogs with a history of relinquishment. So you will see shelter dogs with an increase in separation anxiety. We do have that literature and those studies that have been done. Neglect or poor treatment, cognitive decline that is seen with our senior animals. You may see an increase in separation related behaviors when your dogs become seniors, and they could have not displayed separation anxiety symptoms previously. Reliance on other animals in the home, a traumatic event when left alone. And so this happens, can happen in the summer in particular, because if there's a thunderstorm when your puppy's left alone, sometimes even if somebody comes to the front door, but they're in a crate and they can't get to the door, that can be traumatic for them. Fireworks going off, obviously like a burglary or anything else would be a traumatic event. And it's often seen, it is a comorbid condition, it's called. So it's often seen with noise sensitivities or phobias. So signs of separation anxiety are urination, defecation, destructive behavior. So you'll see dogs chewing or pawing at exits often. So windows and doors, vocalization, barking, howling, whining, salivation, pacing, panting. They won't eat when they're left alone. Diarrhea is one as well. And then immobility, they just will not move, and shaking and trembling. This is a video of a previous patient previous client and patient of mine that we worked on his separation anxiety. And so this is the video, because we absolutely recommend videotaping so we can see what is occurring. And so this is a video of him when he was left alone.
You're fine, buddy. You're fine.
So that is absolutely a dog with separation anxiety. We did check to make sure as well that it wasn't confinement anxiety, and sometimes it can be a combination of both. And essentially confinement anxiety is a dog that does very well outside of a kennel or a confinement space and can actually be left alone, and they're actually more stressed just from the kennel or the crate. But that's very difficult with puppies because they can get into a lot of trouble just being left out by themselves. So it's always recommended to videotape your puppy when you leave so that we know exactly how they're feeling. Consider an adaptyl diffuser. Adaptyl is a pheromone. It's a calming pheromone. And they actually have a collar form as well that we love for puppies from a preventive standpoint. And so you can just put it on. It lasts 30 days. And it's a synthetic version of the maternal pheromone that's produced from a lactating bitch. And so it does help decrease stress and increase calm in puppies. And you can also plug one in, a diffuser in right by your kennel, and that will help as well. Playing calming music has been proven to help prevent stress. So through a dog's ear or iCalm Pets are two compilations you can look up. Placing toys and safe food puzzle toys in the space. Some dogs prefer their crate covered with a blanket. Some do not. Dogs aren't den animals. Much to some traditional information, they aren't actually den animals. Wild dogs are actually only ever found in dens if they are having a litter of puppies. And so that's also why people find crate training more difficult because they're not actually naturally inclined to be in a confinement space. So spend time without your puppy. This is really important. We want them to be comfortable in whatever space you choose to use. So whether it's a gated bathroom or a laundry room or an X-pen with a kennel or their actual kennel, we need to teach these guys to be alone for short durations of time and then work up to the goal duration. And so sometimes I think stress happens just from people expecting that they're going to be okay alone when they're not. And then we do have an increase in anxiety and a negative association with the departure. And so for departures to be successful, we should be videotaping all of them. Don't leave your puppy for longer than you believe they're going to be successful. Ensure that they've had adequate exercise before you leave and some mental stimulation using maybe some training or a food puzzle toy. Increase departure time slowly, and keep a log if you can. I have a great little journal that I like owners to have, and it kind of lets us know, how did we leave them? What confinement space did we use? How long were they left alone? Did we use a food puzzle toy this time? How were they feeling before we left? And if you're having any concerns with leaving your puppy, please absolutely contact your veterinarian. It's very important that they help with this sort of concern. So why is it important to consult with your veterinarian? We need to rule out medical conditions that could be contributing to your puppy's behavior concern, often GI concerns. So vomiting, diarrhea is linked to anxiety. And so that's something that needs to be handled by a veterinarian. They can implement behavior and training as required. They can make recommendations for a veterinary behaviorist referral as needed, discussing nutrition, anti-anxiety supplements or medication if it's warranted. These are all things that your veterinarian can absolutely address. And this is why we recommend seeing a veterinarian if your puppy has any behavior concerns. So setting puppies up for success. So whether you're training your puppy preventatively or you're helping to build confidence, we always recommend using positive reinforcement. Ensuring your puppy's emotional, social, and physical needs are met. That means they're getting enough exercise, they're getting enough sleep. It's absolutely necessary that puppies are getting from about 16 to 18 hours of sleep a day, and that needs to be restful sleep. That they are having positive social interactions with other puppies and other people and other things in the environment. And if you need help, absolutely ask for help from a professional. We offer a lot of options as well. During the pandemic, we have had to do a lot of virtual training, and it works out really, really well. It's really helpful, and we can absolutely generalize it to other behaviors. When, depending on restrictions, we are also offering in-person classes and in-person training, but this is changing based on restrictions. But regardless of restrictions, virtual is always an option, and we can always help doing that. If you want to follow us on social media, once again, you can go to the Facebook page or our Instagram. We have lots of free handouts and resources on the website, which is www.companionvet.ca. And they're under the training tab. You'll see a resources tab. You can absolutely go there. And then we always have webinars and other upcoming events noted on our pages. If you have any questions about this webinar after watching it, or just about training or classes, don't hesitate to check our website, but you can also email us at training@companionvet.ca. Thank you.